Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. You may recall, at least several times early in our podcasting, we introduced the fundamental or the basic way that we've been thinking about practice. We made a tweak, an important change in this conversation. The word is increasingly, and you'll discover as you listen how that treatment brings the meaning of practice more fully into what's real to us on a day-to-day basis. At least I hope that's what we accomplish. Listen in and decide for yourselves. Well, one thing that I've really enjoyed in our collaboration over these weeks and now months, Peter, is that we're never certain that we've got everything we want to say just right. And how could we? And so it means we're involved in continuous improvement, continuous refinement.
And I think I say somewhere in what I've written about practice, a concept of practice, that in fact, the more you think about anybody's practice, the more interesting it gets, the more complex and subtle what that practitioner is doing becomes, and it's kind of an open-ended understanding and process of understanding that we're involved in with any practice. You never fully comprehend a practice, and maybe that practitioner never fully comprehends it either.
Right.
We've certainly heard some of your favorite golfers claim that they're just beginners and they don't really understand the game yet and so forth, having just won the British Open or something. So I interrupted. Go ahead.
No, not at all. I think what we are is we're sort of putting a mirror up to ourselves as we talk about those practitioners and how they're quite fully getting it, or we don't quite fully get what practice means. More thought comes, which makes it a lot more interesting. Hopefully
it does. I think that's what keeps a lot of practitioners in the game.
Exactly. It's just that one more try, just see what happens, and then once it happens. So let me go back to our way of thinking, the seminal way of thinking that got a lot of these other conjectures on the rails, and let's see if there are some improvements that could be made. Practice is the conscious ability fairly consistently to produce intended results, and to do so across a range of circumstances, and to do so while growing and changing oneself. Love that one. To meet the changing circumstances in which one's practice exists. Hey, it's perfect. We can't possibly improve it.
Nice job. Yeah, I mean, we don't want to mess with it, do we?
Yes, we do. How would you mess with it? Because
well,
I think it really kind of hangs there as this like something carved in stone.
Well, I mean, as we have kind of repeated it to ourselves and to our listeners as these podcasts have proceeded, I've developed a feeling that this way of thinking mixes two things, and while they're related, they're not the same thing. One thing is the nature of practice and what practice does, and the circumstances under which practice exists, and so forth, and how practice is the production of intended results. All descriptors of the nature of practice. But the other thing that our way of thinking does is it commits a practitioner to being very conscious and to being very growth-minded and open to change and willing to do what he or she needs to do in order to keep up with the changing circumstances in which the practice exists, and so on and so on. In other words, that our practitioner in this way of thinking is a pretty heady person. And as we've gone along, I've started to say to myself, and maybe some of our listeners have said it to themselves long since, what about practitioners that aren't very conscious comparatively? What about practitioners who aren't paying a lot of attention to their growth and ability to change? Not that they're bad practitioners, they're just not really doing the things that our way of thinking commits them to doing. So we need to remember, I guess, that the practitioner is a human being. Practitioners have different levels of experience. They have different tolerances for ambiguity and uncertainty. They work in environments that have different levels of instability and indeed threat and challenge. And so they're not always the same person, and they're not always as conscious and effective as our way of thinking commits them to being. So I think we need to maybe talk about our practitioner a little bit more.
Yes.
And maybe say some more about what we mean by growing and changing to meet the changing circumstances, or what do we mean by increasing their ability to produce intended results, improve their batting average, so to speak. Because I think, truth be told, most practitioners would admit that their attempt to produce the intended results of their practice is not always successful. And we need to be conscious ourselves of that, so that we don't make out our practitioner to be super prac, some kind of magical being who can do no wrong.
I could just see how that could turn all of our offerings here into something that sounds like a sermon or some kind of idealistic intention that we have for everyone to be that kind of ascending practitioner, or super prac, as you called her or him. But that's not what has, I think, been our intention from the beginning. First and foremost, I think we looked at the under attention of, or the insufficient attention to practice when we talk about theory and practice. That kind of got us going. Then as we got to look deeper into the nature of practice, we were looking at the big P, the one that represents all practices.
Right.
So within that big P, there's a tremendous range of proficiency, maybe excellence, and I agree with you. I'm afraid that sounds like we're saying, "Hey, you're not there yet. You need to listen to us. We're going to tell you how to get there." This is not that kind of a show.
Or we're not going to tell you how to get there. It's your problem.
That's exactly it. So what about this range of, or levels of growth that each of us in a practice is responsible for, mainly responsible for? How would that change our working definition? Do you have some thoughts on how we could put that same way of thinking out there, but something that provides a little bit more hope to those of us, as I am in golf, who are just about started at getting there? I'm playing at it. I'm not yet a golfer. I'm playing at golf. So what might we do with that working
Well, you're reminding me, one of my dear friends, Jerry Harvey, now unfortunately departed, was an avid golfer and considered golf a spiritual experience. But he'd come back to the office from having played in the afternoon or in the morning, and talk about how close he had come to breaking 80. Breaking 80 was his primary objective, and it was his measure of success as a practitioner of the game. So I don't know what your number is. Mine, when I played, which was not very much, mine was, I think, 100. And I didn't break it very often.
Yeah.
But that's because I wasn't a serious practitioner, I think, of the game.
So part of what has to be in the mix is the game itself and the extent to which one is serious about the game itself, not just becoming better per se, but something that there's a hook in the game. And the game isn't just golf or a sport. The hook could be, for thousands of our former students, business itself as a game, a very competitive and very dynamic game, which could therefore, once one has hooked onto that, bring out a lot of effort to become better, maybe by necessity, get better or else in some businesses, particularly very small businesses. So let's go to that working, the way of thinking, to see if just a few things we've said to each other now suggest a little tweak or two.
Well, I haven't got this formulated into a paragraph of deathless prose that I would stand behind. But the word that has come to my mind that belongs in 2 or 3 places in our working definition or working way of thinking is the word increasingly conscious ability. And that implies that somehow over a period of time, a practitioner is improving his or her conscious ability. Another place in our way of thinking that I put the word increasingly was in the phrase we talk about in producing intended results, so that the practitioner is able to fairly consistently and increasingly produce intended results, improve the batting average, so to speak. By the way, we need to bear in mind that not all practices, and probably maybe even the majority of practices, don't have a clear-cut criterion of effectiveness, a score, so to speak. Many practices do, but many don't. So the intended results become a more holistic idea that the practitioner has in his or her mind to produce of what the intended results are. And maybe as an external observer, we would need to spend a fair amount of time interviewing that practitioner and observing their practice in order to understand what intended results meant for that person. This reminds me of one time when I began to get concerned about the famous Vince Lombardi quote, winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. And somebody asked him if he had said that, and he said, no, but I wish I had. But because of the nature of perception, I came up with the following. Winning is only the thing you think winning is. Because I think I've talked about this in an earlier podcast, so many practitioners have different criteria in their minds for what the intended results are and whether their batting average is improving. And then a third place where the word increasing or something like it needs to be inserted is around the idea of growing and changing oneself to meet the changing circumstances in which one's practice exists. I think practitioners are probably all over the map in terms of the effort that they're making and the form of the effort they're making and the time period over which they're making these efforts to grow and change oneself. And I suspect many practitioners are making New Year's resolutions regularly about something they're going to try to improve on in their practice. So I've done, as have you done, a lot of educating and training both in the classroom and in organizational training environments, like some of these whiz-bang training centers that various organizations, corporations, public agencies have built whole campuses to train their people.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I have been in those environments. The inside of the General Electric management development centers up on the Hudson River, as I knew them some years ago, were just like the inside of a Harvard Business School classroom in their design. But anyway, we've been in these environments and we've known these men and women who are very earnestly working on growing and changing themselves to meet the changing circumstances. Sometimes it's just their knowledge they're trying to improve or their skill, but oftentimes it's personal development. It's the development of consciousness. It's the development of ethical sensitivities. I've spent some time doing training in so-called encounter groups or sensitivity training groups or whatever you want to call them, where quite a bit of personal sharing goes on, and tears indeed get shed by men and women who are outwardly successful practitioners, and yet they're struggling with something in their practice or in their lives that is causing them a fair amount of stress. And they're expecting and hoping that the course they're sitting in or the program they're sitting in, that you and I might be at the front of the room for or on the side of the room, will help them. It's their earnestness that always impresses me. And this is especially true of some of the men and women from other countries who are, they're usually it's their corporation has sent them to America to an MBA program or a doctoral program or a non-academic training program of some kind. And they are so determined to develop and to grow and to change. They want so badly to get the best of what's available. It increases my feeling of responsibility to the point where I almost have to remind myself that I'm not perfect and it's not my practice, it's their practice.
Right.
I'm not going to save their lives. My practice is to do the best I can. So all of this is to say that growing and changing to meet the changing circumstances in which one's practice exists is a widely varied set of behaviors. And going back to the beginning of our way of thinking, we would hope that this set of behaviors is conscious. It isn't just reflexive, but it may be just simply a reaction or a reflection to the world they're living in, and not be as conscious as we might wish it were.
Well, it seems to me that first that changing circumstance hits you, and if you're unaware altogether and you're not seeking to know what's going on and what's up ahead, then you may not change very much, but it may, the thing that later on you wish you had spent more time looking into. So that's one thought. But this notion of awareness of a self-assigned obligation to become more capable in a particular line of practice. You've talked about some people who you know from their fact they've come a long way and at great sacrifice to be in a teaching learning situation earnestly. So it's pretty clear that their intentions ride high. But for the hundreds of thousands of other people who are just plugging along, it's hard for me to figure out how they can go from reaction to intention to saying, here's another moment where I can make something better of myself in a big way or a small way. And I always preach, if I'm back to preaching, that if you can do that for yourself, life gets a lot more interesting and fact, you do get better. But without that conscious attention to make sense, I don't know if you can still meet the other parts of your added word increasingly. I don't know that the increasing just happens. It has to come through intention. What do you think?
Largely, I agree with you. There probably are exceptions, but I feel like I've heard practitioners say things like, I've come a long way. I never dreamed that my practice would develop this way when I was preparing for it originally back in whatever medical school. Or you and I have met a lot of men and women who are doing career changes.
Yes.
And sometimes very dramatic career changes. I know many clergy who have retired or resigned from the actual clergy function and are moving over into human resources or starting a business for themselves or something. Some of those individuals are having to deal with feelings of guilt, personal guilt at having resigned from the clergy. Mm-hmm. That they should have somehow been able to transcend the challenges that they were experiencing that finally led them to drop out of the program, out of that particular practice. But plenty of other changes that are perhaps not as dramatic as that, as moving from being a minister to a human resources person in the secular world. But a lot of, from the point of view of the individual, the feeling is of dramatic change and of turning their lives around. So what we've involved ourselves in here is a pretty complex subject, and I'm sure our listeners are experiencing that for themselves in terms of their own ideas about their own practice. I would like to be heard by them as being very supportive of their efforts to improve their practice. Whatever that means for them, that all where you and I are doing here is identifying the issues and trying to put them in a context of the understanding of practice.
I have a flash of thought. I picture a person in two parallel states. Sound like Stephen King here with two worlds clashing. But one state is a state of mind, which we've said earlier, mindful. That state is, I am in practice. I am practicing. I am a practitioner. The other state that runs right alongside, that you can flip over to pretty quickly, is, I'm out of that practice. I'm no longer that. I'm going to be something else. And there's a lot in between. As you mentioned, with clergy, they're sort of on the fence. Do I stay? Do I go? But it's like holding your mind in the I am in practice state, so you don't flip over to that other dimension where you suddenly lose your consciousness of being in practice. And I've experienced it. It just goes away. And you've got to say, oh, okay, wait a minute. I still am striving to be an excellent teacher. So get back up there, put that on, and keep learning on that, keep seeking those results. So that's just a little bit of gestalt that I'm offering, sort of in and out of practice, moment to moment. Does that make any sense?
It's funny. I have not read Stephen King, partly because I've got a tender. I'm easily impressed and easily kept awake at night. And
oh yeah, he'd keep you up.
I have not subjected myself to Stephen King. But I see what you're saying, and it's interesting. Sometimes thinking of these many individuals sitting in one of our classes or one of our training programs, they stick their hand up and say, "Yeah, but how about in practice? You're giving us the theory, Professor Vaill, but what about practice? And in that instant, they are flipping from a growth and development mode to a more hard-nosed practitioner mode who's not going to have a bill of goods put over on them. Because in my experience, this idea of, yeah, but what about in practice, Professor Vaill? You're fine with theory, but what about practice? What about the trenches? What about the firing line? That's kind of said defensively, so to speak, to keep from being sold a bill of goods, whatever.
Inveigled, drawn in.
In our private moments, we are completely sympathetic to that feeling. That's why we're making these podcasts.
That's right.
Because we think that practice has not gotten its fair due of understanding and reflection and conjecture. And so that hopefully after listening to these podcasts, one will never say, what about in practice, Professor Vaill, again, but instead we'll make a more reflective conjecture about how whatever I'm saying or whatever you're saying or whatever some trainer or educator is saying, how that kind of is going down and how it fits with the individual's idea about practice. And it can lead to a more productive conversation than simply firing off, what about in practice? What about in the trenches?
Because I think at the basis of that sort of charge to you or to me is, hey, this is just theory. It's not going to have any use for me. That is their choice. And if their intention is to go through the experience with us and glean something and put it into their practice going forward, if that intention is there, then we can work with it. And so we need to continue to encourage others that you're going to get a lot more out of what you read or what you watch, what you listen to, if you're setting your mind on make use of this, put it into my practice, rather than this is not relevant, I don't get it. It's just a bill of goods that is being sold to me. So I guess I'm harping on this whole notion that an individual practitioner has a tremendous amount of power over themselves and any of us who are trying to explain something, because they can rule it out or rule it in.
Somehow you're reminding me of another dimension of this whole subject, and that's the skill that a practitioner needs to have in working with people who he or she encounters in their practice. This is one of the things I don't think we've given as much attention to in our podcast so far as it warrants. In my opinion, practice of almost any kind, except maybe the solitary carpenter who's building a boat in his basement or something. But practice of almost any kind deeply involves the practitioner in relationships with others.
Yes.
Clients, competitors, colleagues, suppliers, teachers, and that in those encounters, the practitioner's interpersonal skill, self-awareness, sensitivity to the needs of the other is of great importance. And I don't think in education for practice, as I know it, which is principally in business schools, my sense is that the developing practitioners who are majoring in something like accounting or finance or marketing or whatever aren't hearing enough about the absolute centrality of relationships in conducting the practice.
Right.
And so when we talk about developing and changing oneself and developing one's conscious ability, we're really talking about improving relationships with others.
Yes.
And that's conducted with some self-awareness. It's conducted with certainly some sensitivity to the needs of others. There are tons of training programs out there about how to get along with people. Most of those probably are not really linked to a set of issues that might arise in a given practice.
That's right.
But that practitioner who's trying to meet the growing and changing needs of the practice as it exists in their circumstances, that practitioner is acutely aware of the growing and changing needs.
And in those moments, it tends to present those with whom you need to relate. It's sort of like they pop up. If I'm very focused on a skill that I'm not getting the increases that I wish, and I realize the real consequences of not having that skill at the right level, then I know that I'm going to be looking for people related to that need. So in a way, we're the designers of our own learning curriculum in that regard, and therefore being able to relate easily and well is not going to be just to the predictable few. It could be an expert. It could be someone standing next to you at a bus station, and you have a map and you can't figure out how to get from A to B. And I would break into this train of thought just a moment to tell you that a few podcasts ago, I relayed a little story about my work with the town clerks on living a practice life. Well,
Right.
as I mentioned at the end of that, that I gave them each a plastic egg with silly putty in it. So here's the point. I was invited by a former student of mine who's teaching Introduction to Management right at my school, to come in and spend 30 minutes or so with these sophomores and give them something. So I grabbed my little surplus of eggs, and I gave each one of the 30 students a silly putty egg. And then I wrote up on the board in very large letters, impression. And then I said, notice that the egg is closed. That is your mind at a given moment. Close tight, open it and peek in. There's that putty. But in this moment, it has not anything on it. There's no scratches, there's no fingerprints, there's nothing. It's just unformed.
Mm-hmm.
And then the exercise, which you had suggested, was, okay, pair up and tell each other something that you love doing so much that you do it no matter what, whether you're paid for it or whether it was easy, you just love doing it. And while you're listening, I want you to open that egg in front of the other person. And then as that person is coming across to you and you're feeling their passion, or not, just put a little fingerprint on that egg, on that silly putty. And then the other person did it. Then we talked about it. But I said, notice this. Every time you open yourself up to a conversation, to interaction with others, you are giving them a chance to make an impression on you. Call it knowledge, call it learning. And you're, to the extent that they're open to you, making an impression on them. Over a lifetime, your little lump of silly putty is going to have a lot of different shapes and a lot of different marks and hopefully thousands of positive fingerprints that record how you're becoming better at whatever you wish to become. Keep that egg closed. Don't just keep a little peek. take but don't give, you're not going to make it. I think the students got it. My colleague told me in follow up the next week that they got really talking a lot, and and every one of them took their eggs with them.
Yeah.
So I don't know, me in my trying to create these little gimmicky visual activities, but I think the gist of it was what you're saying to me, and that is that the relationships that we need, we require to really do that growing, are part and parcel of our success. Sermon over.
You're reminding me of an epigram. The world is composed of two kinds of people, givers and takers. Mm-hmm. The givers know this, and the takers don't. And your exercise dramatizes the need to be a giver.
Yes.
And that you can't be a successful taker if you're not an energetic giver. And that, I think, is the kind of interpersonal skill that a sound practitioner practices. The ability to learn from others while sharing the benefits of their own practice with those individuals. Takes me back to one of my concerns about this whole enterprise we're involved in. All these practitioners who have been sitting in our classes and our training programs, they may have a lot to give, but we have not been giving them the opportunity to give.
That's right.
Their knowledge of practice. We've been tending, and I think a lot of our colleagues also tend to give these practitioners, to treat these practitioners as every other student, and nothing special about the fact that they've got 20 years of experience with a particular practice. So
we make them sit there with their shells closed and just pay attention and listen to us. Brilliant so-and-sos telling them what life's all about. The more that they not only open up to us, but to each other, the more they're going to learn this interpersonal practice that we've struck upon here in this conversation. Well, I'm looking at the clock, and we want to try to pull a few more threads together to conclude this, but it sets us up for some very interesting conversations next. Increasingly was the modification that you're working into our way of thinking about practice. Increasingly, which gets at intention and attitude.
Uh-huh. Okay. Well, I think we're not done until we're not done with our own efforts. Whether we put them on these podcasts or not is another matter. But we need to craft a way of thinking that recognizes that not all practitioners are the same, mm-hmm. that we are not expecting practitioners to be heroes, developmental geniuses, but just learners like all the rest of us. So that's ahead of us. Is to get a way of thinking crafted that recognizes that fact,
and that the intention, to me, I still say the intention is what takes ordinary effort and gives it that special learning recipe. The more I intend to put together something that an individual calls a practice, anything can be called a practice as long as their intention is to continually work toward increasingly challenging results. Mm-hmm. So that from us, is the people who like to give, is what we look for. Just that spark of intention to explore more deeply what they've gotten their heads into, whether it's golf or running or nursing, of some aspect of nursing, or preaching. But we're acknowledging that, we've said it many times now, there are many moments when those changing circumstances set us back to beginner level again. So that's what I find to be even most encouraging, that just when we think that we've got it all figured out and we're at the top of the heap, the heap becomes, it heaps on us.
The
The
heap
heaps on us.
morphs into something else.
We're at the bottom of the heap. And so we have that beginner status again. But that's pretty, so therefore, all those people we look up to, and there are many I look up to, when I've gotten to know them, as I have you, we find humility and a good sense of humor about how stuff happens. I would say the word shit, but I wouldn't want to put that out on a podcast. But it does happen.
You wouldn't, eh?
Final thoughts.
You're right. Stuff does happen. And it seems to me an effective practitioner understands that. The practice is never going to be what he or she may ideally wish it would be. I think those are my final thoughts.
And I would add to that, and thank goodness, what the heck fun would it be to be in life? And you think exactly the way you want whatever it is that you can do very well. And you say, okay, it's done. Give me the certificate. Put the plaque on the wall. Yeah. Then what? So hopefully we fall in line with practices that never let us feel completely accomplished. And therefore, we're never going to stop learning and meeting very interesting people on the way, because we can't learn alone. So Peter, thank you for another great conversation. I look forward to our next one. And
thank you, Dave.
We're doing well here, I think. We haven't figured it all out yet. We got more work to do.